In a valley cupped between ancient sleeping hills, there was a creature born of shadow and misfortune. He was a bull, but not like the others. Where there were sleek rivers of muscle, coated in hides of burnished copper and deep mahogany, he was a jagged coastline of mismatched parts. One horn grew straight and true, a formidable spear aimed at the sky, but the other curled back on itself, a gnarled, broken question mark against his skull. His hide was a chaotic map of scars and coarse, dust-colored patches, and his eyes, deep and intelligent, held a stillness that the villagers mistook for menace. They named him Ferdinand, not with affection, but as a kind of cruel joke, after a storybook bull who loved flowers. A creature of gentleness this beast could never be. He was kept in a pen at the edge of the village, a pen built of thick, weathered timber that felt more like a cage. The other animals shied away from his fence line. The villagers hurried past, averting their eyes, muttering about his unsettling silence, his sheer, unwanted presence. He was a bad omen, a broken thing, a walking failure of genetics, destined for only one purpose: the quiet, unceremonious end at the slaughterhouse. The date was set. It was a matter of simple economics, of cold, hard pragmatism. But in that same village lived a girl named Ilara, and Ilara could not see the crooked horn, the scarred hide, or the unsettling stillness. Ilara was blind. Her world was not one of sight, but of sound, of scent, of the subtle vibrations that traveled through the soles of her feet. And from her small cottage, she could hear a sound no one else bothered to listen to: the low, mournful sigh of the rejected bull, a sound that wasn't a threat, but a lament, a sound of profound, crushing loneliness. And she decided, with the pure, unwavering conviction that only the innocent possess, that she had to answer it. What happens when a girl who sees with her heart steps into a monster's cage? What happens when the one thing everyone fears is met not with a weapon, but with an embrace? The answer would not just save a life, it would shatter the very foundations of a village built on fear, leaving everyone, believers and skeptics alike, weeping in its wake. Ilara's world was a tapestry woven from threads the rest of the village ignored. She knew the time of day by the angle of the sun's warmth on her face and the specific pitch of the sparrow's chatter. She could distinguish her father's footsteps from 100 yards away, a steady, heavy rhythm of love and worry. Her fingers could read the story of a stone, its smooth parts speaking of the river, its rough edges telling of a fall from a great height. Her blindness was not a void. It was a different kind of canvas, painted with sensations the sighted world was too busy to notice. Her father, Kyle, a man whose hands were as calloused as his heart was soft, had built this world for her, a sanctuary of textures and sounds. He narrated the sunset to her, describing the colors as the feeling of a warm blanket settling over your shoulders for orange, or the cool, smooth kiss of evening air for purple. He surrounded her with wind chimes and fragrant herbs, creating a map of sensory landmarks she could navigate with perfect confidence. But there was one sound that lay outside their carefully curated world, a sound that pierced the gentle symphony of her life. It was Ferdinand's lonely call. To the villagers, it was a guttural annoyance. To KL, it was a reminder of the harshness of farm life, a sound to be shut out. But to Ilara, it was music. A sad, beautiful song in a minor key. It was the sound of a heart beating in isolation. She would sit by her window, her head tilted, and listen. She heard the tremor of sorrow in it, the deep thrum of a power that had no outlet, a strength that had turned inward, festering into a quiet despair. "What does the big cow sound like to you, Papa?" she asked one evening, her small hands tracing the patterns on a frosted window pane. Kyle paused from mending a fishing net. "He sounds angry, little bird. Big and angry. It's best we don't think on him." But Ilara shook her head. Her expression was one of profound certainty. "No," she whispered, more to herself than to him. "He's not angry. He's just alone. It sounds like the way the last bell feels when everyone has gone home from the festival. It sounds like an echo." Kyle watched his daughter, a familiar ache of love and fear tightening his chest. Her empathy was a miracle, a gift. But in a world that did not understand it, it was also a vulnerability. He saw the world's sharp edges, the cold logic that governed life and death on a farm, and he wanted to shield her from all of it. He especially wanted to shield her from the broken bull in the pen at the edge of town, the one whose days were numbered, the one whose sorrow his daughter could somehow hear from across the fields. He didn't know that you cannot shield a healer from a wound that calls to them. He didn't know that Ilara was already walking toward that sound in her mind, her heart already reaching across the distance, preparing for a meeting that would change everything. The day it happened began like any other. A pale, watery sun washed over the valley, and the familiar routines of the village began to unfold. Kael was preoccupied, haggling with a trader over the price of lumber, his back turned for only a few minutes. It was all the time Ilara needed. She didn't plan it as an act of defiance. It was an act of necessity. The bull's low moan had been a constant, mournful hum on the edge of her hearing all morning, and it had finally become a pull she could no longer resist. She slipped out of their small yard, her bare feet knowing the path by heart. The familiar soft dirt gave way to the rougher, stone-strewn track that led toward the outer fields. The air changed. The sweet smell of her mother's herb garden faded, replaced by the raw, earthy scent of livestock and damp soil. She could feel the vibrations of him through the ground now, the sheer weight of him. When she reached the pen, the immense reality of him washed over her. He was a mountain of warmth and breath. The air around him smelled of hay and dust, and a deep animal musk that was tinged with something else, the metallic scent of sadness, like unshed tears. She reached out her small hands, her fingers finding the rough, splintered wood of the fence. "Hello," she said, her voice a small, clear bell in the heavy silence. From 20 yards away, a group of farmers, including the pragmatic and stern-faced Silas, stopped their work. They saw the blind girl, Kael's girl, standing at the monster's pen. A collective gasp went through them. Someone shouted for Kael. Panic, sharp and electric, shot through the air. Ferdinand, who had been standing with his head hung low, lifted his great head. His one good horn glinted in the sun. He took a heavy step forward, the ground shuddering. The farmers tensed, expecting a charge, a roar, the splintering of wood. Kael, hearing the shouts, spun around and saw his daughter. His heart stopped. "Ilara, no!" he screamed, his voice raw with terror as he began to run. But Ilara didn't hear him. She heard only the soft, inquisitive snort from the creature in front of her. She found the latch on the gate, her nimble fingers working the simple mechanism. It swung open with a low groan. She took a step inside. The world seemed to hold its breath. The farmers were frozen in horror. Kael was a lifetime away, running through molasses. Ilara walked slowly forward, her hands outstretched, until her fingers brushed against something coarse and warm. It was Ferdinand's leg. She laid her palm flat against his side, feeling the immense, slow rhythm of his heart, the tremble of his powerful muscles. He didn't move. He just stood, a statue of suspended disbelief. And then, she did the impossible. She wrapped her small arms as far as they would go around his massive head, pressing her cheek against the rough, scarred hide just below his broken horn. It was a hug. A simple, profound act of connection. The great bull, the monster, the reject, did not roar. He did not charge. He let out a long, slow breath, a sigh that seemed to carry years of loneliness with it. He lowered his head, gently, carefully, until his massive brow rested against her tiny shoulder. And he became utterly, completely still, a stillness not of menace, but of peace. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the sound of Kael's ragged breath as he finally reached the pen, stopping dead in his tracks, his eyes wide with a terror that was rapidly turning into sheer, heart-stopping awe. The image was seared into the minds of everyone who saw it. The tiny, blind girl in her simple dress, her arms wrapped around the head of the beast they all feared, and the beast himself, a mountain of muscle and rage, surrendering to her touch as if it were the only thing he had ever wanted. For a long moment, nobody moved. The wind whispered through the tall grass, the sun beat down, and the world seemed to pivot on that single silent embrace. Kael stood at the open gate, his heart a wild drum against his ribs. Every instinct screamed at him to snatch his daughter away, to pull her from the jaws of a danger he couldn't comprehend. But his eyes told him a different story. He saw the bull's posture, the gentle lowering of his head, the soft, fluttering exhale of his breath against Alara's hair. It was not the stance of an aggressor. It was the posture of a creature finally, blessedly, at peace. Slowly, cautiously, Kael took a step into the pen. The bull's massive eye rolled to watch him, but there was no fire in it, only a deep, weary intelligence. He remained perfectly still, a living statue guarding the child. Silas and the other farmers watched from the fence line, their faces a mixture of disbelief and grudging wonder. This defied all logic, all experience. Animals, especially ones as powerful and unpredictable as this, did not behave this way. It was a trick of the light, a fluke, a one-in-a-million chance that could have ended in tragedy. "Get the girl out of there, Kael," Silas called, his voice tight with authority, but lacking its usual conviction. "It's not safe. That thing is a stray spark away from disaster." But Alara seemed to be in her own world. She pulled back from the hug and began to run her hands over Ferdinand's face, tracing the jagged line of his scar, the rough texture of his broken horn. "He's not a monster, Papa," she said, her voice filled with a quiet, unshakable truth. "His heart is just loud. It's been shouting for a long time, and nobody was listening." Kael finally found his voice, a choked whisper. "Alara, come here, please." She turned her face toward the sound of his voice, a serene smile on her lips. She took her father's hand, but kept her other hand on Ferdinand's muzzle. The bull rumbled, a low soft sound deep in his chest, not a growl, but a purr. The sound vibrated through Alara's arm, a direct communication of contentment. Later that evening, after the gate was latched, and Alara was safely tucked into her bed, the village elders gathered. Silas stood before them, his arms crossed, his face set in a grim mask of pragmatism. "It was a spectacle," he admitted, his voice low. "But it changes nothing. We saw a moment, a trick. We cannot risk the safety of this village on the whims of a child and a broken beast. He's a liability. The butcher is still coming on Friday." A murmur of agreement went through the small crowd. They had seen a miracle, but fear was an older, more powerful instinct. The moment of wonder had passed, and the cold reality of their world settled back in. A decision made of fear is a fortress, and not even the purest act of love had been enough to tear it down. The countdown for Ferdinand had not stopped. It had only been paused by a hug. The village's decision settled like a shroud over Kael's home. He watched Alara, who seemed to carry a new light within her, a quiet joy that radiated from her small frame. She didn't understand the finality of the elder's verdict. To her, the matter was settled. She had met Ferdinand, she had felt his true nature, and she knew he was good. The idea that the world would destroy something good simply because it didn't understand it was a cruelty her mind could not yet grasp. Kael was torn. One half of him, the terrified father, agreed with Silas. He had seen what that bull could do. He had seen the fear it inspired, and he knew the raw power contained within its frame. But the other half of him, the part that had witnessed his daughter's impossible miracle, could not ignore what he had seen. He had seen peace where there should have been violence. He had seen surrender where there should have been rage. A forbidden seed of hope had been planted in his heart, and he found himself secretly watering it. The next day, Alara asked to go see her new friend. "Just for a minute, Papa. I want to bring him something." Kael's first instinct was to say no, to forbid it, to protect her by reinforcing the cage around Ferdinand and the walls around her own world. But looking at her upturned, trusting face, he couldn't do it. He remembered the bull's gentle stillness, the soft sigh. Against his better judgment, he found himself nodding. "I will come with you," he said, his voice firm. "And we will stay outside the fence. Understood?" Alara beamed. She went to her small garden and picked a handful of chamomile flowers, their white and yellow faces bright against the green stems. She hummed a little tune as she walked beside her father, her hand tucked securely in his. As they approached, Ferdinand was lying down, a great, sad mountain in the middle of the pen. But, at the sound of Elara's humming, his head lifted, his ears swiveled, and a low, welcoming rumble started in his chest. He lumbered to his feet and walked to the fence, waiting. He didn't look at Kale. His entire being was focused on the small girl. Elara reached through the wooden slats, offering the flowers. "These are for you," she said. "They smell like sunshine and calm thoughts." The bull, a creature of grass and grain, lowered his massive head, and with the most incredible delicacy, lipped the small bouquet from her fingers with his soft, wet muzzle. He didn't eat them. He held them gently for a moment before setting them down on the ground in front of him, a strange and tender offering. Kale watched, his breath caught in his throat. This was not the behavior of a mindless beast. This was something else. This was communication. This became their secret ritual. Every day, under Kale's watchful and increasingly less fearful eye, Elara would visit. She never went inside the pen again. Honoring her promise to her father, the fence became their meeting place, a threshold between two worlds. She would talk to Ferdinand, telling him about her day, about the shapes she felt in the clouds her father described, about the songs the river sang. And he would listen, his great head cocked, his deep eyes fixed on her, occasionally giving a soft rumble in response. The villagers saw. They whispered. Some were softening, their fear giving way to a grudging curiosity. Others, like Silas, grew more resolute, seeing it as a dangerous sentimentality that was blurring the lines of safety and order. The fence was no longer just a physical barrier. It had become a symbol. For Silas, it was a necessary line between human and beast, order and chaos. But for Elara, it was simply a place to rest her hands while she spoke to a friend. And for Ferdinand, it was the boundary he would never cross without invitation, a testament to a respect the villagers had never once offered him. The whispers in the village grew from a murmur to a low thrum of debate. The story of the blind girl and the bull had taken on a life of its own, becoming a small, local folktale told in hushed tones. The sight of Elara at the fence, her small form a stark contrast to Ferdinand's immense one, was now a daily tableau. It was unsettling. It was beautiful. It challenged the simple, hard-line truths they had lived by. Some villagers started leaving small bundles of sweet hay or windfall apples near the fence, offerings made when they thought no one was watching. They were small acts of conscience, tiny cracks appearing in the wall of their collective certainty. But fear is a stubborn weed. Silas saw this softening as a threat to the village's pragmatism. A bull was livestock. A broken bull was a loss to be cut. Sentimentality had no place in the ledger of survival. The date for the butcher's arrival loomed, only 2 days away. Silas felt the pressure of the community's wavering resolve and decided he needed to put an end to the fantasy. He called another meeting, not of the elders this time, but of the whole village, held in the open square. He stood on a wooden crate, his face etched with grim determination. "I see what's happening," he began, his voice ringing with authority. "I see you watching the girl and the beast. And I see you forgetting what that animal is. It is a ton of unpredictable muscle. One bad day, one spook, one moment of instinct, and that girl's friend could kill her. We are being charmed by a fairy tale, and it's going to get someone hurt." He let his words sink in, then offered a compromise, a test. "The trader who's buying him for meat is also looking for a new lead ox for his logging team, a strong, steady animal to pull timber from the high forests. He says our bull is the right size, but he doubts his temperament. He says a bull that looks like that is bound to be a rogue." Silas pointed a stern finger toward Ferdinand's pen. "Tomorrow we will test him. We will yoke him. We will see if he can pull a heavy log without rage, without panic. If he can prove himself useful, truly useful, and steady, then perhaps we can spare him. But if he fights, if he shows even a hint of the monster we know him to be, then the butcher comes on Friday, as planned." And there will be no more discussion. A wave of murmuring swept through the crowd. A test. It felt fair. It was a practical challenge, a way to measure the beast's worth in terms they understood. Strength and obedience. Kale's heart sank. A yoke was a symbol of submission, often forced upon an animal with pain and fear. Ferdinand had known nothing but isolation and mistrust. To suddenly be confined in a heavy wooden yoke, forced to pull a burden, it was a test designed for him to fail. It would provoke the very rage Silas expected to see. That evening, Alara could feel the tension in her father's silence. "What is it, Papa?" she asked, her hand finding his. He explained the test to her, his voice heavy with resignation. Alara listened, her face calm. When he was finished, she said something that struck him with its simple, profound wisdom. "But they're testing the wrong thing," she said quietly. "They want to see if he's strong. We already know he's strong. They should be testing if they can be gentle." She stood up and walked to the door. "I need to go see him," she said. "I need to tell him what's happening." And as she walked toward the pen in the fading light, a small child, on a mission to explain the flawed logic of the world to a bull, no one could have predicted that the true test was not the one Silas had planned for the next day. A much greater test was already brewing in the bruised, purple clouds gathering over the mountains. The sky that night was a restless ocean of dark, churning clouds. A storm was coming, not the usual summer rain, but something wilder, angrier. The wind began to howl through the valley, rattling window panes and tearing at the thatched roofs of the cottages. It carried the scent of rain and ozone and a deep, primal fear. The villagers secured their homes and their livestock, their faces tight with worry. The test of the bull was forgotten, replaced by the immediate and far more powerful test of the storm. Kyle stood at his doorway, watching the trees bend and sway, their leaves ripped away by the furious gusts. Alara sat inside, preternaturally calm, listening to the symphony of the wind's fury. She could feel a strange energy in the air, a trembling in the earth that went beyond the storm's power. By midnight, the storm broke in all its terrifying glory. Rain came down not in drops, but in solid, wind-driven sheets. Thunder cracked overhead, a sound so violent it seemed to split the very fabric of the sky, and lightning illuminated the landscape in stark, terrifying flashes. In one of those flashes, K.L. saw it. The old oak tree on the rise above Silas's barn, a landmark for generations, was struck by a bolt of pure white fire. It exploded, not with a flame, but with a shower of splintered wood. The massive trunk, weakened by the blast, groaned, leaned, and then fell with a deafening crash directly onto the roof of Silas's main barn. The barn that housed his family's prized milk cows, the heart of his livelihood. A scream cut through the howl of the wind, not of an animal, but of a person, Silas's wife, Lena. She had been inside, trying to calm the panicking animals. The falling oak had collapsed the main support beam, trapping her leg beneath its impossible weight. Silas, who had been struggling to secure an outer gate, heard the scream and ran, his heart seizing with a terror that dwarfed any fear he had ever had of a broken-horned bull. He saw the wreckage, the splintered roof, and heard his wife's cries for help from within the dark, debris-strewn interior. He and a few other brave villagers who had rushed to the scene tried to move the beam. It was immense, waterlogged, and impossibly heavy. It wouldn't budge. They were helpless. The rain poured in through the gaping hole in the roof, and Lena's voice was growing weaker. Every tool they had was insufficient. Every ounce of their collective strength was not enough. They were watching a tragedy unfold in slow motion, utterly powerless to stop it. It was in that moment of absolute despair, as Silas fell to his knees in the mud, that a new sound joined the storm's chorus. It was a sound of splintering wood, but it wasn't from the barn. It was the sound of Ferdinand's pen giving way, not from the storm's force, but from a deliberate, focused act of power. The villagers turned, their faces illuminated by another flash of lightning, to see the great bull standing free, his crooked horn pointed not in aggression, but toward the sound of the cries. He took a step, then another, his massive form a silhouette of raw, untamed power, moving purposefully through the driving rain, directly toward the ruined barn. The sight of Ferdinand, free and moving with intent through the heart of the storm, sent a fresh wave of panic through the small group of villagers. Their first thought was not of rescue, but of danger. A terrified, enraged bull loose, in the middle of a chaotic emergency, was their worst nightmare made real. "He'll bring the whole thing down!" someone yelled. "He'll kill her!" Silas scrambled to his feet, ready to try and drive the beast away, to sacrifice the barn to save his wife from being trampled. But then another figure emerged from the rain, small and drenched, walking with an impossible calm directly toward the bull. It was Elara. Kael, who had run after her, skidded to a halt, his shout of her name swallowed by the wind. Elara didn't run. She walked right up to Ferdinand, who had paused as if waiting for her. She placed her hand on his wet, muddy flank. She didn't speak words that could be heard over the storm, but she leaned close to his great head, her presence a beacon of tranquility in the chaos. Ferdinand responded to her touch, a low rumble vibrating through his chest. He then turned his head, nudging her gently back toward her father, a clear gesture of protection, before turning his full attention back to the barn. He approached the wreckage, not with the wild charge of a panicked animal, but with the slow, deliberate assessment of a seasoned worker. He lowered his head, his good horn and the solid mass of his skull pressing against the side of the fallen oak beam. The villagers watched, mesmerized, their fear forgotten and replaced by a stunned, breathless silence. With a guttural groan that was a sound of pure effort, Ferdinand pushed. His powerful legs dug into the mud, muscles straining, his entire body a single, focused lever of immense power. For a heart-stopping moment, nothing happened. The beam was too heavy. Then, with another earth-shaking bellow of exertion, Ferdinand shifted his weight, found a new angle, and pushed again. Slowly, miraculously, the great beam began to move. It scraped against the floor, lifting inch by painful inch. Just enough. "Now!" Silas yelled, snapping out of his stupor. He and the other men surged forward, pulling Lena from under the crushing weight. They dragged her clear just as Ferdinand, his job done, stepped back, the beam thudding back into place. The bull stood there for a moment, his sides heaving, steam rising from his drenched hide into the cold, rainy air. He looked at the rescued woman, at the stunned faces of the villagers, and then he looked at Silas. There was no menace in his eyes. There was only a quiet dignity. In the eerie calm that followed, the only sound was the soft patter of the rain and the collective, ragged breathing of the people whose lives he had just irrevocably changed. Silas stared at the creature, the monster he had condemned, the beast he had been so certain was a harbinger of disaster. And in the middle of the storm, surrounded by the ruin of his barn, he began to weep. They were not tears of loss or fear. They were tears of shame, of gratitude, and of a profound, shattering awe. The sight of their staunchest skeptic, their most pragmatic leader, brought to his knees by the grace of the animal he had wronged, was the final undoing. One by one, the other villagers felt the sting of tears in their own eyes, a cathartic release for a community that had just witnessed the true meaning of strength. The storm passed as dawn broke, leaving behind a world washed clean and glistening. The air was crisp and cool, carrying the scent of wet earth and new beginnings. The villagers emerged from their homes not to assess the damage, but to gather in the square, their faces etched with the memory of the night. They were a different people than they had been 12 hours before. The fear that had been the bedrock of their community had been washed away by the rain and a bull's impossible courage. Ferdinand had not returned to his broken pen. He stood quietly in the field beside the ruined barn, as if standing guard. He was no longer an outcast. He was a silent, muddy sentinel. A little while after sunrise, a small procession made its way toward him. It was Silas, his wife Lena leaning on him for support, her leg bandaged but her eyes clear. And walking beside them, holding her father's hand, was Elara. The rest of the village followed at a respectful distance, a silent congregation coming to witness a final act of reconciliation. Silas stopped a few feet from Ferdinand. The bull watched him, his gaze steady and unnervingly intelligent. The man who had been the voice of fear and doubt now stood humbled before the creature he had so profoundly misjudged. He looked from the bull to the small, blind girl who stood beside him, her face serene. "I was wrong," Silas said, his voice thick with emotion. He wasn't speaking to the crowd, or even to Kale. He was speaking to Alara, and perhaps to the bull himself. "I spent my whole life looking at the world, judging everything by what I could see. The strength of a wall, the health of a crop, the flaw in an animal." He gestured toward Ferdinand's crooked horn. "I saw this, and I saw a defect, a danger. I never once thought to look deeper. But you," he looked at Alara, his eyes filled with a new kind of respect. "You saw with something better than eyes. You saw the truth. And last night he showed us all that truth. He then did something no one ever expected." Silas, the proud, pragmatic leader, took a step forward and bowed his head to the bull. It was a gesture of profound apology, of deep and earned respect. "Thank you," he whispered. Later that day, there was no talk of the butcher. Instead, Silas and the other men gathered their tools. But they didn't go to repair the barn. They walked to Ferdinand's pen. With deliberate, rhythmic motions, they began to dismantle it. They pulled the posts from the ground and stacked the weathered timbers to the side. They weren't just taking down a fence, they were tearing down a prison built of fear. They were removing the last symbol of the village's blindness. As the final post was pulled free, Ferdinand stood in the open field, untethered, for the first time in his life. He was no longer the reject, the monster in the cage. He was simply Ferdinand, the guardian of the valley, his crooked horn no longer a mark of imperfection, but a unique crown he had earned. In the months that followed, the rhythm of the valley found a new, gentler cadence. The story of the storm and the rescue became the village's defining legend, a modern parable told to children not as a fairy tale, but as a lesson in seeing with the heart. Ferdinand became a beloved, free-roaming presence. He was no longer feared, but revered. Children, who once ran from the sight of him now, left him offerings of clover and apples, patting his scarred hide without an ounce of fear. He would often be seen grazing peacefully on the hillside, his immense form a comforting landmark against the green slopes. His favorite spot, however, was a small, sun-dappled meadow just behind Kale and Alara's cottage. He would wait there for her, and she would come and sit with him, leaning against his warm, solid side, reading her finger books or simply telling him about her day. Their bond, once a forbidden secret, was now the celebrated heart of the community. The crooked horn that had once marked him for death was now seen as a symbol of his uniqueness, a reminder that the things the world deems broken are often the vessels of the greatest strength. Silas, a changed man, rebuilt his barn with the help of the entire village. He would often stop by to see Ferdinand, leaving him the sweetest cuts of hay and speaking to him with a quiet reverence. He learned from Alara not just to look, but to listen, to feel. His leadership, once rooted in rigid pragmatism, was now tempered with a deep and gentle wisdom. The fence was gone, and with it, the invisible barriers that had existed between the villagers themselves. They were more open, more compassionate, quicker to help, and slower to judge. The bull they had rejected had, in the end, redeemed them all. Have you ever judged something, or someone, based only on what you could see? Have you ever mistaken a quiet exterior for a lack of feeling, or a flawed appearance for a flawed character? The story of Ferdinand and Alara is a quiet reminder that the most profound connections are often invisible. They are not seen with the eyes, but are felt with the soul. They are the bridges built not of wood and stone, but of empathy and acceptance. The world may tell you to build fences, to fear the unknown, to cast out what is different, but perhaps the greatest strength lies not in building walls, but in having the courage to take one down. Perhaps true sight is simply the bravery to reach out in the darkness and offer an embrace, trusting that the heart you find will be just as beautiful and just as lonely as your own.